Hey there, YouTubers. It's Don from trueCABLE. How you doing? Well, I'm coming back to you again with more content. No doubt, if you've been out shopping for your Ethernet cable installation, you've noticed a million and one choices for RJ45 connectors, and there are quite a few choices out there. Many of them aren't going to fit your cable properly. So that's what this video is here to address. It's all about RJ45 plugs and which one that you need to use for your cable. So grab a cup of coffee and let's go ahead and get this party started. Okay, so this doesn't look exactly evil. It doesn't look like it's devilish in any way. It's just an innocent looking little piece of plastic, right? So why is it that these particular plugs, RJ45s, whatever you're calling them, are such a source of consternation and debate and frustration? Well, the reason has to do with the fact that the standard doesn't really specify the fitment of the cable that goes inside the plug. In other words, that's different from manufacturer to manufacturer. And that's really what matters when you're selecting an RJ45 plug, is what kind of cable it takes. But before we go down that road, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what exactly these are and where they came from. RJ45 stands for Registered Jack 45. It's more of an industry term. In reality, these are called 8P, 8C plugs, which means 8 position, 8 conductor. And that's because it's designed to accept Ethernet cable that has 8 conductors. And the standard is pretty bland about exactly how these have to be designed by a manufacturer. They have to be a certain length, they have to be a certain width, they have to be a certain height so they fit into a standard port. They have to have a latch on them to keep them from pulling out on you. And they have to have some sort of retention mechanism built in so that the cable jacket can't pull out of the plug and ruin your termination. That's usually accomplished with what's known as a strain latch, and that's that piece of plastic that's right here that's found inside of this rectangular cutout. So really that's all there is when it comes to talking about RJ45 connectors, and I'll just refer to them as RJ45s for simplicity. But what really matters is getting the fitment down and the proper type of connector to use for your cable. And that's where things can get really hairy, and that's what we're going to talk about next, which is actually how do you select the right one. The very first step in selecting the proper RJ45 connector is you need to decide whether you're going to be using shielded, like this, or unshielded. Now, on the outside, like I said, they're dimensionally the same. They have to be. They've both got 8 contacts for 8 different conductors, and they both have those retention latches. But one is shielded and one is not. So in which situation would you use, for example, a shielded RJ45? Well, if you happen to have shielded Ethernet cable, and this is an example of one of them, this is a overall foil shield. And this foil shield needs to make proper electrical contact with the metal of this plug. That's so you have proper shield continuity going back down so it can drain off any excess electrostatic discharge or EMI RFI. Now, when it comes to dealing with unshielded plugs, it's very simple. You simply use unshielded cable. This is an example of an unshielded cable. There is no overall foil shield in here, therefore this plug doesn't need to be metal because you're not looking to bond your cable shield with the outside metal of the plug to continue an electrostatic discharge path. So, quite simple. If you're using shielded plugs, then that's what you use for shielded cable. If you're using unshielded plugs, that's what you use for unshielded cable. But, of course, it's much more complicated than that, and now we have to talk about fitment. So that's up next. Stay tuned again. Okay, so before we get talking about the very technical specifics of fitment here, I'm going to give you an example, and it should make it crystal clear. When was the last time you walked into a shoe store and ambled your way on over to either the men's or women's section, depending on your gender, and simply grabbed a pair of shoes off the shelf and assumed they'd fit? Probably never, right? So it's the same situation with an RJ45. Okay, so we know it has to be unshielded because this is an unshielded cable, for example. But what about fitment? What's going to fit into the back of that plug? Well, the problem is that the industry has, in a way, what they're trying to do is make it easier on you to shop for accessories. So they'll label like Cat6 onto a bag of RJ45 plugs. The fact is, though, is that because that happens to be a Cat6 plug and this is a Cat6 cable, that does not mean that this plug is going to fit that cable. In fact, even if this says it's compatible with 23 AWG, and this cable happens to be 23 AWG conductors, that still doesn't mean that this plug is going to fit that cable. Yeah, it's a little more complicated than that. So what really matters are two things. The first is the overall thickness of the cable jacket. That's called, in our particular specification, the cable jacket OD, or outside diameter. Basically, it's the thickness. And will the plug accept that? The next thing is this insulated conductor. Now, like I said, you've heard of things referred to maybe as 23 AWG, 24 AWG. Well, that's the copper under the insulation. The thing is, though, you don't strip off the insulation from an Ethernet connector prior to putting it into a plug. The whole thing goes in. So you need to know what the conductor insulation diameter is, and that's the copper plus the insulation. Once you know the numbers on the cable and you know what the plug accepts, then you can make an intelligent choice. In this particular case, this particular plug can handle 0.95 to 1.05 millimeter insulated conductors. These particular insulated conductors are 1.02 millimeter. Therefore, they're going to fit. They fall right in the middle of the range of what the plug can accept, so that's great fitment. The other thing is that the cable jacket here is 7.30 millimeter in diameter, and this particular plug happens to accept up to 7.30 millimeter in cable jackets. So that plug should definitely fit that cable, and that's how you select it. It's really quite that simple. Now, there's some additional tips and tricks that I'm going to share with you that'll help make this process easier, because there's a lot of different variations of these on the market. So what are you looking at when you're looking at one? So we're going to get into some tips and tricks next. Okay, so the first tip I'm going to give to you here is buy more plugs than you need, please. I can't tell you the number of times I've been on an install and I wasn't thinking ahead and I needed more plugs than I expected, but the plugs that I needed were specially fit to the cable I bought. I couldn't buy the plugs locally. It's not like I could head over to Home Depot or Lowe's and get the right ones. I couldn't. So an entire install ground to a halt just because of one stinking plug too short. Or you may make some bad terminations, or you might want to be practicing with these guys, which you should, to get good at terminating them, because practice makes perfect. So buy more than you need. That's a really good piece of advice. If you take nothing away from more than that from this tips section, take away that. The next thing is that plugs come in a, not only shielded and unshielded, but they come in a dizzying array of ways to terminate them. You've got shielded style with external ground. You've got them with internal ground. That has more to do with the size of the cable, and because sometimes plugs need the ground on the outside to accept a really big cable on the inside. Also, there's the pass-through style plugs, which tend to be more convenient to use. You put the cable jacket into the back, you pull the conductors out the front, and you can confirm the sequence prior to termination, and then the conductors get flush cut off. And that can make life real easy for you. One word of warning is that Ethernet cable, especially the insulated conductors, that plastic can change tolerances from lot to lot, spool to spool even. So it's very important that you have proper fitting pass-through plugs. Well-fitting pass-through plugs, I would even hasten to add. And the reason is that they're very sensitive to something getting out of whack when it comes to tolerances. So trueCABLE has gone the extra mile of making certain that if our Ethernet cable should vary in tolerance a little bit, the plug will still work. But as soon as you go from one manufacturer to another manufacturer, when you're mixing components and accessories, pass-through plugs may start causing you trouble. So just be aware of that. The next style, and one that works really well and is compatible with a wide range of our cable, is we have a unshielded staggered load bar plug, which has a solid nose. The conductors don't come out the front. And what happens is that you actually will pass this load bar over your conductors flush cut at the front of the load bar, and then you'll put the whole assembly into the plug like that, and it puts the wires right under the golden contacts. And this particular plug is less sensitive to variance in cable thickness tolerances. So if you have something that varies a little bit, this is more forgiving. And when it comes to category 6A cable in particular, this particular plug, because it is a staggered design, does tend to give better crosstalk performance at the connector, everything else being equal. That does not mean that the pass-through plugs don't work well on Cat 6A. They do. And I've proven it with Fluke DSX 8000 testing. It's just that if I was to put two cables next to each other, or the exact same cable, terminate that one and test it, and then terminate a load bar plug and test it, a staggered style, it turns out that this staggered load bar plug gives you slightly better performance at the connector. So if you're looking for max performance, especially with our Cat 6A riser unshielded cable, the staggered load bar plug is like my personal go-to. But that doesn't mean that I won't use a pass-through either, because I will, depending on how I feel that day. Hey, what can I tell you? So apart from plugs, another thing that comes up quite a bit is, do you really need a strain relief boot on your Ethernet cable? And the answer is, in a perfect world, nah, not really. It's more cosmetic. However, the world is far from perfect. I mean, just describing what can go wrong with an RJ45 plug is enough to kind of tell you that you need every advantage you can get. The reason being that the weakest link in any termination, or I should say the weakest link in any Ethernet system, is the terminations. That's what you are doing as a human being. You're putting on these plugs. There's going to be tolerance differences between one piece of plastic to another. So the weakest link in the chain is always the termination, so you need all the help you can get. As it turns out, the strain relief boot does a couple of important things. One is that it helps to stabilize the electrical contacts here at the end, because if you bend the cable, like when you're installing it, for example, this strain relief boot helps take pressure off of the strain latch. And if you take pressure off the strain latch, it's less pressure eventually on your golden contacts. And it is possible that if you have a cable that looks like it's properly terminated, but it shifts while you're bending it and putting it into place, that it could cause a problem at the contacts and therefore a bad connection. The other thing is that the strain relief boot reminds you how far you should bend your cable. So it's a good reminder that's sort of like built in for you. So I do recommend strain relief boots. It's a very good idea that you use them, because like I said, you need every advantage you can get when you're putting on RJ45 plugs. So that pretty well covers RJ45s and some of the tips and tricks I recommend and some of the things that I've learned over the last number of years. I hope you liked our video. Give us a thumbs up or a thumbs down as you see fit. Subscribe to our channel. And I enjoyed showing you this, and please leave a comment or question below. I'd be happy to answer it. You have a great day and happy networking.